Well, I'd like to welcome everybody this afternoon. My name is Jenny Denyer, and this is our 1 o'clock session in the Judith Herb College of Education Spring Symposium. And I want to especially welcome our fifth graders from Marshall Elementary School, Marshall STEM Academy. We are so
Hi,
glad you're here. I can see hands waving. That's fabulous. We're glad that you can be with us. And we have a kind of a theme, not kind of, we have a theme for our symposium, and it's called Stories Matter. And we all have great stories to tell. That's what we want to focus on today. I know that all the fifth graders that are watching and all of the adults and all of the teachers that are watching all have stories that they tell all the time. They might be stories about the funny thing that happened at school yesterday, or it might be the funny thing that happened with your pet, or it might be a sad story that you tell. You might tell stories to your mom and your dad or your grandma or your uncle. You might tell stories to your friends. All kinds of stories get told. And when we tell stories about ourselves, we let people know more about us. They get to know us. And when we hear stories that they tell us, we get to learn more about them. And that, we think, is a really exciting chance for us to learn about new people, new ideas, new events. So this afternoon, we are especially happy to have with us an author and an illustrator, someone who decided not just to tell stories, but decided to write down his stories and illustrate those stories so he could share them with lots of people other than those people that he just might see on a day-to-day basis. And so I am really happy to have Innosanto Nagara with us this afternoon to share some stories that he has written with all of us. I know that the fifth graders probably already have been thinking about some questions they might like to ask Eno after he reads some of his stories to us. But you can keep thinking in your heads about other questions that you might have as you listen today. And for those others who are attending the symposium and this particular session, if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat, and we'll make sure that we convey those to Eno, and he'll have an opportunity to answer those. So I'm going to turn off my video and mute myself. And Eno, I'm going to turn everything over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me? Yes, awesome. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be able to join you in your classroom. I wish I could be there in person. I love visiting actual people in actual classrooms, but one of the nice things about Zoom is, or WebEx or whatever this is that I am in Oakland, California, and I'm able to visit you just without having to get on an airplane. So I'm really excited to be here with you today. So my name is Innosanto Nagara, and I am an author and illustrator of a number of children's books. My first book was called A is for Activist. This is a book that I wrote for my kid when he was 2 years old, and it was one that I just thought was going to be something that I was going to read with him and maybe with some friends as they were all little kids. And then it ended up being published and ended up turning into an actual book that got distributed around the country and around the world, and it became a bestseller. So this launched me off as a children's book author. I never thought I was going to be an author. I thought I was going to be a biologist. After I wrote this book, people asked me, what's your next book going to be? And again, I still did not think that I was going to be an author. I just had written a book, so I figured, you know, that doesn't make you an author. I just have one book. And I ended up writing Counting on Community. After Counting on Community, my kid at that point was in first grade and wanted to have books that were more stories, and I ended up writing My Night in the Planetarium, which I just read to some of your friends in third grade earlier this morning, or this afternoon on your time. And this is a true story from my experience as a kid, which is not too dissimilar from M is for Movement, which is what I'm going to read with you all today. I think you did get them in your classroom, hopefully. Yay! Awesome. That's great. It's so much, since I can't be there, it's great that you actually have the real books there. So the story with my books are, A is for Activists was about the issues. Counting on Community, it's kind of about how we live. My Night in the Planetarium is about art and resistance and colonialism and how you overthrow a dictatorship. And The Wedding Portrait, I didn't mention, this is another one that I wrote, this about the story of a photograph and why sometimes we break the rules. This is about direct action and civil disobedience, and why pretty much anytime we've seen change happen, it's happened because people are willing to break the rules. And the question for kids is, where and when do you break the rules, and why is it sometimes important to do so? But you all are in fifth grade, and my kid's in fifth grade, and some of you are reading some really thick chapter books at this point, and some are reading some books that are less, that have more pictures, some like graphic novels, some like different things. But the book that I wrote, M is for Movement, was a book that I wrote for when my kid was about third or fourth grade, and I read it with a lot of kids who were sort of in the older age group. You all are even older than that, but I think hopefully some of the stories are still interesting to you. It's an easy read for kids in your age group. So what I'm going to do, if this is okay with you all, is I'm going to read some excerpts of it. I know you all can read it yourself, but a lot of times it's useful to hear how the author sounds reading it. Might give you some ideas about how I was thinking about it, but of course when you read it, it's how you think about it, which is most important. And then we can maybe have some question and answer after that. I think they're going to queue up the image of the book so you can be looking at it. Screen share, Susanna, thank you. That's the cover. M is for Movement. I'm going to start with chapter 1 just to set the stage. Okay. Oops, I need to put on my glasses. All right. Chapter 1, Monsoon Born. I was born in the eye of a monsoon storm. The storm had been pounding the island for days. My parents lived in a small house in a kampung on the island of Java. Kampung means village, from a long time ago when you had to walk through the forests and rice paddies to get from one to the next. Back then, each kampung was part of a kingdom, and there were many kingdoms here. The kings were always wanting more power, and sometimes they would go to war with each other. The villagers were always caught in the middle. They would pretend that they loved their king and hated the king next door. But all kings took their rice and made their young boys fight and kill and die in their wars. The villagers didn't really care which king was their king. Everyone except for the royal family hated the king. Our island may not be what you think of when you think of an island. For one thing, it's huge. It takes 3 days to drive from one end to the other. Over the years, the kampungs grew into cities, the cities into big cities, and the big cities into one huge metropolis. There are no longer any rice paddies left around my kampung. Just houses and streets and more houses and more streets. By the time I was born, 10 million people lived in my city. My kampung is called Menteng. My city, Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. There are 17,000 islands in my country. It is a land of islands. So many that you can't see them all on a map. There are even islands where real-life dragons still live. Look up Komodo dragons if you don't believe me. On Java, it wasn't unusual to have storms at that time of year. It was monsoon season. But this storm came during another kind of a storm, a political storm, a time when people were clashing over who should rule the country, a time of turmoil. I was just being born, so I didn't care about any of that. And my parents, who usually cared a lot about what was going on in the country, that night only cared about me being born. The storm raged for days, and many parts of the city were flooded. We were lucky that Menteng was on a bit of a hill, so our house was wet, but not underwater. Still, nobody could go anywhere. The water was rushing through the streets like a raging river. Our electricity had been out for days, so my parents lit a kerosene lamp for light. The wind was howling and whistling through the windows. The lamp was flickering like it was going to go out at any moment. Flashes of lightning lit up the sky, followed almost immediately by deep, rumbling thunder. Nobody was going out in that storm, not even to have a baby. Then, almost suddenly, the whistling of the wind stopped, and the pounding of the rain on the roof died down. You could still hear the storm rumbling off in the distance, and there was a light pitter-patter of small raindrops hitting the windows. But otherwise, all was still. All was quiet. It was the eye of the storm. It was then that I let out my first howl, and the whole kampung knew that I was born. So this is just setting the stage, chapter 1, so you know where we are and where the story goes. You're going to read this story yourselves probably, but I'm going to skip ahead just to read some other parts of this. There's going to be the story about this kid who is growing up in Indonesia. There's a bunch of things that are happening politically in Indonesia at the time, and some adventures that this kid goes through, some choices that he makes, some that are better than others. And you will see some travels through Jakarta. And I'm going to now jump to chapter 4, The Other Storm. Yep. I mentioned that the real storm was not the monsoon, but a political storm. Revolution was in the air all over the world. There was a lot of news about what was happening in the United States because they had just lost a war in Vietnam. This is, back in the 60s, yeah. The US president had been forced to resign. Activists from organizations like the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, and the United Farm Workers were fighting for people's rights. A new generation of activists was building: the feminist movement, the gay liberation movement, the environmentalists and anti-nuclear movements. It was a time of change. The rest of the world was on the move too. From Latin America to the Middle East, from Southeast Asia to Europe and Africa, change was in the air. My parents and their friends talked about South Africa and the Soweto Uprising. South Africa was another diverse place that, like Indonesia, had been colonized by the Dutch. That history is complicated, and other colonizers like the British also tried to come in and take over. Groups like the Zulu Nation had fought back and won. But when I was a kid, the main problem was a small number of white South Africans who had stayed and set up a country where white people had all the rights, and black South Africans, and anyone else who wasn't white, were considered second-class citizens. They called the system Apartheid, and it meant separate schools, separate neighborhoods, and separate jobs, with all the good schools, houses, and jobs going to white people only. So of course people fought back, but when anyone tried to resist, the apartheid government would arrest them, or worse. The most famous resistance leader from South Africa, whom you have probably heard of, was Nelson Mandela. He spent 27 years in jail for standing up against apartheid. But when I was a kid, Mandela was in jail, and a new generation of younger activists was taking the lead. The Soweto Uprising started in the township of Soweto when the government tried to force black South African kids to speak Afrikaans in school. Afrikaans was the language of the apartheid regime. Everyone else spoke other languages like Zulu and Xhosa at home. So black South African students said no and marched out of school in protest. 27,000 students marched out of school, elementary school students, middle school students, and high school students. The government sent their police in to stop them with force. Many were hurt. Some were even killed. But the protests didn't stop. The resistance didn't stop. In fact, the resistance continued for many years until the end of apartheid. Eventually, Nelson Mandela would be elected president of South Africa. At the time, nobody knew that would happen, or what would happen, but many people around the world were inspired by the bravery of the South African students. My parents were the ones who told me the story about the students leading the Soweto Uprising. They never told me that I had to do that kind of thing. In fact, my father always said, whatever you do, don't get arrested. The military here is really mean. But of course, I knew he himself just barely escaped getting arrested for one of his books, and many of his friends had been arrested. And I knew my mom had gotten arrested in the United States when she was a student protesting segregation, which was the US version of apartheid. This was something that she was proud of, so I felt I was getting mixed messages. So this also goes on. I'm going to stop there for this chapter, let you read the rest of it yourself. It sort of gives a sense of kind of the stories that we're going to be talking about in this book. I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead to the next chapter, chapter 5, The Epidemic. And did I mention this book is technically fiction, meaning it's not like a true story, although some of it's true. And a lot of it is about things that really did happen. Some of it is things that happened to me for real. Some of it is stuff that happened in the world. Some of it's stuff that happened to other people. Some of it is stuff that didn't exactly happen exactly the way that I'm telling the story. So this is all part of storytelling. And I try to be very clear about that up front, that this is not a true story, but there is hopefully a lot of truth that you will be able to find in this book. We can talk about that a little bit more later. So chapter 5, The Epidemic. For me, it started with my mom giving me some pills. I don't know if I even asked what they were for. I just took them as instructed. There's a lot of life in the tropics, which also means that there are a lot of germs and parasites. The Dutch colonizers had ruled Indonesia for 350 years and took all our resources without spending any money on the things that you need to make sure that the water is clean to drink and food is safe to eat. So there were often outbreaks of mosquito-borne diseases like malaria and dengue fever, bacterial infections like cholera and typhoid, and parasites like amoebas and tapeworms. Those of us who could afford it would get our vaccinations and take pills to avoid getting these diseases whenever there was an outbreak. But many people couldn't afford vaccines and pills. We knew that that was unfair, but our family could afford it, so we kept up to date on our vaccinations and our pills. When my mom gave me some pills to take, I took them without asking any questions. I was in second grade. That day, my tummy was feeling kind of rumbly. It wasn't a stomach ache, but I felt really gassy. I was sitting at my desk when suddenly I felt something was wrong in my underwear. I froze. Had I somehow had an accident in second grade? I was mortified. I felt something on my left thigh. I looked down, and there it was, a tail. I was growing a tail. It was clearly a tail. It was a bit lighter colored than my skin, kind of almost see-through, but fleshy, definitely fleshy, and it was attached to me. It had to be a tail. I looked around to see if anyone had noticed. Thankfully, everyone was working on their assignments. My teacher was at her desk, busy writing something, so I slowly put down my pencil. I grabbed my new tail with my left hand and I got up. Keeping my tail hidden in my hand, I shuffled up to my teacher. My stomach hurts. I really need to go to the bathroom. She looked at me. We weren't usually allowed to go to the bathroom during class, but she could tell from my face that making me stay was going to cause problems. Perhaps even the kind of problems someone was going to have to clean up. Okay, she said, but come right back. I went slowly to the door as soon as I was alone, and as soon as I was alone, I ran as fast as I could with one hand holding my tail. When I got to the bathroom, I locked myself in the stall. I let go of my tail and it fell to the floor. I was confused. It seemed to me like it had to be at least 2 feet long. It looked like a long white sausage. I had no idea what was going on, so I just squatted on the floor staring at the thing on the floor. All kinds of thoughts were running through my mind. Was I some kind of mutant devil child? I knew I was different, and being different was a superpower, but did I really want to be that different? Like the kid with the tail kind of different? I took a closer look at my now detached tail. Okay, it fell off, so maybe it's not a tail. Tails don't fall off. But what is it then? A snake that somehow got into my underwear? A worm? A big worm? Wait, worm. What did my mom say about those pills she gave me yesterday? Did she say something about worms? Yes, of course. It was a tapeworm. Tapeworms are a type of parasite, an animal that lives off of another animal. Tapeworms start out as eggs and are too small to see. The eggs get eaten and then hatch in the other animal's stomach. And then they grow by eating the food that the host animal eats. In this case, I was the host animal. And apparently, I'd been growing a big old tapeworm in my gut. It was big enough that I should have named it, like a pet. The pills my mom gave me must have fleshed it out. I was relieved to have figured out what it was, and that was pretty much the end of it for me. But I was one of the lucky ones. Apparently, there was a tapeworm epidemic in Jakarta that year. A lot of money had been given to the minister to be used for public health campaign. The Department of Health and Sanitation was run by his son. So all that money that was supposed to be spent to help prevent this stuff, like tapeworm epidemics, but that money had mysteriously disappeared. No dirty water treatment plants were ever built, and since only people like us who could afford it were getting tapeworm pills, lots of other people were getting really sick with tapeworms. Some people tried to complain. They organized a demonstration in front of the minister's office. The organizers had hoped that a lot more people would come out and protest, but most were still too afraid in those days, and for a good reason. The police arrested the leaders of the protest, and many others had to go into hiding. The minister sat watching from his big office window, scowling. So that the minister is one of the other characters in this story that got introduced a little bit earlier. If you read through it, you would know roughly who he is. That's the selection I'm going to read for now. I hope you enjoyed it. And in the last class, we had kids were able to come up to the microphone for questions, but maybe in this class, it might be different. Let me know how best to do the Q&A part. Teachers on there, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I see somebody approaching.
Great.
If we have somebody asking a question, we can't hear you yet. Okay.
Go ahead.
Great.
I just wanted to ask, what made you want to write this story?
I'm sorry, I was a little muffled. Can you try again?
I just wanted to ask, What made you want to write that story?
What made me want to write this book?
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah. So the way I think of it is, um, A is for Activists is a book that I wrote originally for my kid when he was 2. That's sort of about the issues, about what are the things that we care about. Counting on Community was a book about how we live, about how community and sharing and together we can build a better world. My Night in the Planetarium was the book that I wrote that was about colonialism and and art and resistance, and how we can change things through creative action and working together. The Wedding Portrait was about direct action and civil disobedience, about how, in order to make change, sometimes we have to change the rules. And M is for Movement was was sort of my attempt to kind of pull all that together. It's about how it's not any one of these things, but it's about movement, about how together we can make change. But before it's about all that, it's a story about a kid growing up in Indonesia at a time of turmoil and when things can be scary sometimes, and this kid doesn't always make the best choices. Um, just like all of us, we all make mistakes, and it's about how this kid's life weaves through a time of change, which is kind of like the time that you all are growing up in right now. You know, this between the last administration and COVID, and this is a real historic time that you all are navigating through, and you will remember this time when you're my age. Hope that answers your question.
How did you come up with this book?
I'm sorry?
How did you come up with this book?
How did I come up with that book? Yeah, I mean, that is, you know, because it's all my other books are memoirs, essentially, what they call memoirs, autobiographies, something that is just about my true experience, and then I would talk about other things, but they start with a true experience. The M is for Movement I wanted to do as a fiction, even though some of the stories are true in them, and some of them are not. But the this one I really didn't want to just have be another story about me. Um, And so it all really started with that first line. I was born in the eye of a monsoon storm. I was I had been started thinking about that line, and I really wanted to launch off from there. I tested that out. Because I would be going to classrooms and talking with kids and like, hey, if I wrote a book that started with I was born in the eye of a monsoon storm, would you want to read it? And a lot of kids said yes. So that's how I decided to keep going with that one.
This story really,
You have to be loud.
this story really true. Because I didn't really look at it.
She wants to know if you really had tapeworms inside you when you were a kid.
Haha. So this is always a difficult question for me when I first wrote this book because some of the stories are true and some of them are not, as I mentioned. And I had to decide, like, am I going to tell people what parts of this story are real and which parts are not? Because part of the idea of a story book that's out there is it's not really my story. Once it's out and you're reading it and I'm not there telling you the story, most kids are going to read it and they're going to get the story as the story is to them, and it becomes your story. And I want my books to not be so much about me as much as about the stories in them, whether or not they actually, some of it actually did happen to me. But I've also always made the promise that I will answer questions kids ask me honestly as I can. And so I said, well, if kids do ask me if this is true or not true, I will let you know. But for some people, they would prefer not to know what parts of a story is true or not true, because they would prefer to be able to lose themselves in the story. So I'm going to answer the question, but anybody who doesn't want to know the answer to the question of whether or not this is true or not, you can close your ears and you can keep it in the realm of your imagination. Already, the answer is that story is true.
Go ahead. You can hear you, just say
Real
it.
quickly, she just had a follow-up before
Mhm.
we switched students. She just wanted to know, like, she didn't really, when you were reading, she wasn't sure how the tapeworm actually got inside of you. I know that you explained it a little bit in the book, but it's something we're not familiar with here, you know, our clean water.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
maybe explain a little bit.
Yeah, no, perfect. And I understand y'all are a STEM school, so science is, I came to the United States originally to study zoology. I'm all about the science, and that's why I wanted to actually include some of this in the story. So the thing with tapeworms is their eggs are microscopic. You can't really see them, so it gets into the food system, the water system. And here in the United States, you can, most places, well, less and less so. There's definitely places now where this is not the case, but it was the case that you can, with investment in clean water systems, you can drink water out of the tap. In Indonesia, you can't drink water out of the tap because there's parasites and bacteria. And in this case, I don't know exactly which food I ate that had the tapeworms in it, but at the time it was happening, and which is why I was taking the pills. And basically it gets ingested. It ends up entering your body through eating or drinking, but you don't see them. So you don't, whatever you're eating and drinking seems like it's clean because it looks clean, but turns out there's microscopic parasite eggs, and then the eggs hatch and side you, and the tapeworms grow.
How can kids be activists?
How can kids be activists? So it's interesting. That's a good question. It's an interesting question for me because, I wrote this book called A is for Activists, and I write all these kids' books about social change and about activism. But I actually, my idea of this stuff is, I'm not here to tell you how to be an activist. It's not so much about that there is a one way or a good way, a best way. You actually are the next generation, and you all are actually the ones who are going to define what the future of social justice and social change work looks like. Um, my my main message to kids is really that, in the framework of activism, within the idea of that activism is something that has a long history, that people have been doing for many years, and that pretty much all progress, anything good that's ever happened, has happened because people have been willing to be activists, to wear that label and stand up and fight for their rights. But the way that we contribute to that movement, and that's why we're talking about M is for movement, the way that you participate in engaging in social change work and essentially changing your own lives, finding the best way for you to have what we call agency, the best way for you to have an impact, for you to have a way of contributing to the world, is going to be individual to each of you. Each of you is going to know eventually what you can contribute best to the world. So I live with a lot of people who are activists. I live with teachers, I live with organizers, I live with people who are doing activism in many different kind of ways. Some of them, the way that they are activists is they're really good at talking to people. They go door to door, talk to people every day about how to make change and how to, what things that they can do that will make a difference. That's one way of being an activist. I live with people who are really good at standing up in front of a crowd and getting everybody all excited and motivated to go home and go do change, to go do things to make change. And I live with people who are writers. They're much more quiet. They may communicate their ideas through writing, and they don't like standing in front of a crowd. I'm not somebody who likes to stand in front of a crowd, and I do my work through graphic design and illustration and through writing my children's books. And so I think for you all, the important thing is not that there is any one way or even a list of ways that I would say that that you should be an activist. People who know you individually might have better suggestions. But what I would say is that think about yourself as an agent of change, as somebody who has the ability to contribute, regardless of who you are or what your gifts are.
David, how's that?
I,
Look in the camera so I can see you.
I want to know why you wrote humans can't eat golf balls.
However, I didn't even see that. It was great.
Good eye. Well, you should take the time and read the book if you can, because that will answer the question. And I'm not saying that to be coy about it, but it's, that's one of the stories that's in the book. And that's actually the title that I wanted to have the book be. I thought the book should just be called Humans Can't Eat Golf Balls, because that phrase comes up later in the book. And let me see. I'll give you a little summary of what happens. It's basically that one of the stories in this book later on is that there are some people who decide to build a golf course, and they take the land from the farmers in order to build this golf course. And the farmers start protesting against that, and the students join the farmers' protests, and because the farmers were getting beaten by the security, but the students were hoping that because that they were, they represented a different part of society, that they would be able to help them a little bit. And so that was the Humans Can't Eat Golf Balls was one of the things that the protesters carved into the golf course, so that people, as a protest, because you need farmers more than you need golf balls.
Just talk loud, we can hear you.
What advice would you give to future authors?
Advice to future authors. That's a good question. I guess my general advice around, when people come to me, I guess it depends on what kind of an author you want to be and what you want to write. But for me, my experience was that I was somebody who did not necessarily see myself as a future author, as somebody who was going to be an author. My life plan was around being a zoologist, and then later it became about being an activist and a graphic designer. And then I found my way towards writing, and I guess the lesson from my experience would be that it really is something that that whether you plan it or not, or whether you think of yourself as that way or not, or whether other people think of you as that or not, that you probably, that you, if you choose to, it's a path that you can take. And the way that I launched into that is by not worrying too much about what other people thought and whether or not other people had ever said that, oh, you should be an author, or whether or not even I thought I should be an author. It was when I had the idea of the story that I wanted to write, I wrote it. And I think one of the questions that I often get is, how long does it take me to write something? And I will say, oh, it'll take me a day. And that really is an answer that a lot of authors don't like to hear, because they've spent years writing their story, and it's kind of a joke because it's not entirely true. But what is true about it is that when I feel like I'm inspired to do something, and this is also for my graphic design work, I just do it. Like and I don't mean this as like a Nike slogan. I meant it is like, you always have to take that first step. And if you wait until you think you can do it perfectly, or wait until somebody else gives you permission to do it, then you can find yourself waiting for a long time. And, you can always fix things. You can write something quickly in one day and then revise it and revise it and revise it until it gets good. And there's, but if you don't write that first word, if you don't write, I was born in the eye of a monsoon storm, then it will never become a book. So it's kind of like the metaphor that my housemates use who like to go fishing. It's like you can't catch fish if you don't put your hook in the water. You can't stand there talking about fishing and and playing with your gear. And it doesn't mean that those things don't make a difference. It doesn't mean you can't learn by talking about fishing. Doesn't mean that you don't need to pick the right bait and all this kind of stuff. But eventually you have to dip that fishing hook in the water if you want to catch a fish. They're not going to jump out at you. So it's a similar thing with writing. I think it does mean read a lot so that you get a good idea of what you like and what you don't like. You should, of course, practice writing a lot. That's just for practice. But at some point, start writing the book that you want to write, the story that you want to write.
Hi. Thank you for your time today. I just wanted to ask a real quick question about your art, because I thought it was really interesting and inspiring. So is that,
Sure.
or is it paint, or what is your medium?
It's interesting. I do everything on a computer. I do like I am going for a very organic texture and lighting thing with my work, but it is all actually illustrated from the start to finish, pretty much. I mean, occasionally I'll make some sketches or I'll make some textures and I'll photograph it or something, but it's all done on a computer. Part of it is it's kind of like my process around writing. On the computer, it's easier for me to draw. I used to draw things by hand a lot, but I never liked my drawings. I was always frustrated because I couldn't get the lines perfect. I was erasing and fixing and erasing and fixing. And on the computer, I can do that. I can draw my line and then I can fix it. And so that's what works best for me. There's a lot of artists who really get good at drawing those lines the way they want it in their mind's eye. But for me, I have a hard time thinking ahead that far. But what I do is I trust my process. I know that if I start with that line, I can fix it, get it right, and then I can add the layers that I want until it's perfect. So.
Thank you. I saw a question in the chat from Christina. She asked, is it hard to do your drawing? So similar question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't find it hard. It's kind of what I do day in and day out. I think for some books, some spreads in books, what's hard is the concept. I've been doing the illustration work for long enough, and I'm not saying that it's not it's taken me many years to have the confidence and skills to be able to do it. easily. But for me at this point, the actual illustration part is less hard than coming up with the ideas of things, so that of what is it that I want to use to illustrate that, so that it's not the thing that I've already done so many times, you know, trying to find new and fresh ways of illustrating ideas.
Great. Do we have any other questions?
There
No?
was a follow-up in the chat. Oh, so you have been drawing for about 5 years?
No, I actually, because my illustration work and my work as a graphic artist precedes my children's book work, I've been drawing for about 40 years.
Wow. That's impressive.
I mean, what I mean is, you know, I started drawing when I was a kid, and I got my first computer to do illustration. I mean, I did in high school. I did some, but computers back then weren't so good for drawing. But my first good computer that was good for drawing was the Mac Classic that I got when I was in college. So maybe more like 30 years, not 40, but yeah.
I have an invitation that I'd like to extend to the 5th graders. We heard Eno say a few moments ago that when he has an idea for a story, he just sits down and he writes it. And he worries about making it better later on. But when he's got that idea, he sits down and he writes it. So I would like to invite the 5th graders, as you read more of Eno's books, as you think about your own experiences that you've had, my hunch is that there might be somebody listening today who will say, I've got a good idea for a story. And I want you to hear Eno's voice in your head saying, sit down and write it. And then your teachers could send it to me, and I would make sure that we pass that along to Eno.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I love sharing and going back and forth with around, not, you know, about projects, writing projects, illustrations that kids are working on, and just any other questions you might have. I'm always open. You're welcome to contact me through your teachers and through the symposium organizers. It's always an honor to be asked to look at things that you all are working on.
Great. Thank you so much, Eno. We appreciate your offer to look at these stories and answer more questions and illustrations as well. Thank you for your time with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of the 5th graders. We're so glad you could join us today. We're also, I noticed that Christina says she's going to try writing a story. So, but she feels like it might be hard. But she can give it, just try and see what happens. Okay? Thank you, 5th graders. Thank you, teachers, very much. And thank you to all of our attendees who have joined us for this session. We appreciate that, and hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. We have 2 more sessions in the symposium, one beginning at 2 o'clock with Benjamin Sapp from the Maza Museum. And then we have our panelists all together this afternoon at 4 o'clock, as we have an opportunity to talk about some of the big ideas around telling and illustrating our stories. So thanks, everybody. Once again, have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see some of you in other sessions. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.